started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium presentation titled, "Oh my God, what are they thinking? Adolescent Brain Development and Implications for Decision-Making, Injury Prevention, and Criminal Justice" by Dr. Douglas Diekema. Today's talk is part of the 2024-2025 Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium Series, or OBHC. It's a 7-part indoor speaker series that addresses complex issues and critical questions in bioethics and the medical humanities. Dr. Diekema, who's our guest speaker today, is a professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine with adjunct appointments in the departments of bioethics and humanities and internal medicine in the School of Medicine and the Department of Health Services in the School of Public Health. He's also an attending physician in the emergency department at Seattle Children's Hospital and serves as the director of education for the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics at Seattle Children's Research Institute. He's been a member of the Seattle Children's Hospital Ethics Committee since 1991, served as an ethics consultant for 26 years, has been the chairperson of the Institutional Review Board since 2000, and founded the Center for Pediatric Bioethics at Seattle Children's in 2004. He's the past chair of the Committee on Bioethics of the American Academy of Pediatrics and past board member of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. He currently serves as the chair of the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Subjects Protection in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and as a member of the FDA's Pediatric Advisory Committee. Dr. Diekema's research interests include clinical and research ethics related to children and public health ethics. In addition to numerous scholarly publications in bioethics and pediatric emergency medicine, Dr. Diekema's bibliography includes the textbook Clinical Ethics in Pediatrics, a case-based textbook. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Douglas Diekema.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to have been invited. And I think Prasanna is going to monitor the chat for me. So if anything comes up, he'll either decide to interrupt me with those questions or comments, or save them to the end, and we'll have time at the end. So my topic is, in fact, OMG, what are they thinking? I'm going to talk about the adolescent brain and implications of what we know about adolescent brain development for, in particular, clinical decision-making. We all know and have known for years that adolescents often make decisions differently than adults do. It hasn't always been well understood exactly how that and why that happens, but hopefully I will give you some sense of that today. And so we are going to talk about the adolescent's sort of current role in medical decision-making, and then do a little abbreviated tour of the adolescent brain, and finally end with some implications of that science for adolescent decision-making, particularly with regard to capacity to consent and assent in clinical settings. I'm going to start by talking about the case of Dennis. It was actually this case that got me thinking again about our traditional approach toward adolescent decision-making and wanting to take a more in-depth look at how adolescent brain development occurs and whether we were actually doing these things correctly. Nothing I tell you about Dennis's case is private at this point. His case was actually well publicized in the press and the following legal proceedings. In brief, Dennis was a 14-year-old. He had a fairly difficult upbringing. His parents were both addicted to illicit substances that translated into Dennis being neglected to some degree. He had come across he had come to the attention of Child Protective Services on several occasions. The school had concerns, and in his very early teens, he was removed from the custody permanently of his parents, and his aunt was given custody of him. His aunt was a Jehovah's Witness. Dennis began going to church with her, and certainly by the time he came to medical attention, he was very attached to the church. He wanted to join as a Jehovah's Witness, and he subscribed to the beliefs of that faith. At 14, he was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. At that time, it carried about a 70% chance of cure with chemotherapy and transfusions. And consent was obtained to embark on that path. Chemotherapy was started, and then it became, once Dennis's count started to drop, which is inevitable with chemotherapy, it became clear that neither Dennis nor his aunt was going to find blood transfusions acceptable. And so his aunt withheld formal consent, and Dennis refused to get a blood transfusion. And that is when the crisis began. And ethics became involved, and ultimately the legal system. Dennis's biological parents also became aware of what was going on, I think in part because of the media coverage at that point. They came to town and registered their objection. And although their objection carried no legal weight because their custody had been revoked, I think in the minds of many it carried some ethical weight. Ultimately, Dennis was brought to a judge. Dennis's situation was brought to a judge who declared him a mature minor, and unfortunately, that led to Dennis's death within a couple of days. So that's the case of Dennis, and I want you to keep that in mind as we first talk about sort of how we traditionally think about decision making on behalf of somebody who is a minor, or in Dennis's case, 14. We widely recognize parental authority, particularly in the United States, but in many countries, if not, well, most countries. And it's felt that there's good moral, social, and legal grounding for giving the parents the authority to make weighty decisions for their children. We call that parental permission in the pediatric realm, as opposed to consent, even though the legal field still considers what you get from a parent to be consent. We call it permission in part because consent, if you look at the Latin origin, it actually is something you do for yourself, not for somebody else. That doesn't mean that it necessarily is any less important. But the other piece of certainly US jurisprudence is that parental authority, like surrogate authority in adult cases, is not unrestricted. And the state in general is justified in intervening when a child is endangered by a parent's decision. And so that's sort of the legal frame. Now, I have written extensively in the past about what I think the legal and ethical justifications for state interference in these cases are, and I think it's grounded in John Stuart Mill's harm principle. And basically what I've argued is that when you have a parental decision, and you can use Dennis's aunt's decision as an example, that places the child at significant risk of harm that is serious and imminent. And I think there's widespread agreement that Dennis was in such a situation, given that his condition required a blood transfusion. There was no alternative therapy available. He would die without that transfusion. That certainly makes it serious, and the risk of that is 100%. It was imminent in the sense that something needed to be done, and needed to be done relatively quickly. I use imminence sort of to refer to situations where you have reached a point where you no longer really have the luxury of having time to seek alternative avenues, like persuasion and discussion with the family. Interference has to be necessary to prevent the harm, and then in this case, a transfusion was. It needs to be likely to prevent the harm or have proven efficacy, and blood transfusions do that. They're used widely in this situation and almost always successful, at least in restoring counts. And it has to be not associated with a similar risk of similarly serious harms. In other words, there's a proportionality argument. And so you're weighing the risk of a transfusion against the risk of death. And then finally, there have to be no less intrusive alternatives. And for the ethics piece of this, that may be the most important criterion, because we feel very strongly that state intervention is a harm in and of itself. It is a significant disruption of family relationships, and it should be a last resort. And that means that you really, really have to exhaust alternatives that don't rely on state force, alternatives like persuasion and discussion, for example. All of which had been pursued in this case. Now, the question that comes up, if you think about that, again, Dennis's case, he's 14 years old. Under these conditions, having met these criterion, this is a slam dunk from the traditional parent-child, physician, or medical provider relationship. All of these criterion are met. It very clearly justifies state intervention. Dennis needs to have a blood transfusion as long as the state authorizes that. And if Dennis were 7, this case would have gone no further, and a judge would have almost, at least if the history of these judicial determinations is any indication, the vast majority of judges would side with the medical team in these cases. But the question that was raised in Dennis's case was, okay, but we have this third actor here. We have, granted, still a minor, but Dennis is 14 and he has his own opinions, and he's expressing those, and he's telling us that he will resist physically, and, he's a big boy. And so the additional question got thrown in, well, if, under conditions like the harm principle, we would seek state interference with the aunt's decision, does Dennis have his own independent decision-making authority? And that's really the question that was faced by the judge, for example, and to some degree, the medical team. Now, the U.S. legal framework with adolescence and consent is a little confused. We have these buckets where adolescents are allowed to consent. Conditional consent occurs in emergency situations, and those are generally situations that occur in my clinical realm, the emergency department, where a minor shows up without a parent, without somebody with the authority to consent. And the law generally grants us the ability to care for that child's emergency conditions. It does not allow me to sort of move on to conditions that are not emergent. And then all states have condition-specific exceptions, which are to some degree public health exceptions, where adolescents, sometimes attached to a certain age, are generally given the right to consent for themselves for care related to psychiatric conditions, substance abuse, pregnancy-related care, and sexually transmitted diseases. And pregnancy-related care generally includes birth control. And all of these look slightly different from state to state with regard to what they cover, for example. If you think about the STD, sexually transmitted disease portion here, there's broad agreement that it covers the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases. But sometimes questions come up for something like the HPV vaccine, which is preventative. And there are some states that specifically identify prevention of STDs as part of what an adolescent to consent for, and other states that are silent on that issue and therefore leave providers to have to make their best estimate as to whether something that's preventive, like the HPV vaccine, would be included. And then where things get very murky at a state level is when you start talking about emancipated minors and mature minors, and there are states that conflate those two things, and there are other places that separate them. Um, in general, I think the best way to think about these is emancipated minors are those who have met certain sort of objective conditions. They and they've been emancipated sort of in general by often a judge. So, for example, and emancipation laws, actually, many of them have their roots in a time where uh, the legal age in many states was 21. And and so emancipating conditions included things like being in the military and being married and all things that you could do before the age of 21. And it seemed ridiculous that somebody in the military or somebody who was married couldn't consent to their own medical care. Um, and so these emancipation laws exist largely for that sort of situation. Mature minor laws are sort of an extension of that in the sense that, and this is what was invoked in Dennis's case, a minor who has been able to demonstrate that they can understand the nature, purpose, and consequences of a proposed treatment um, can be recognized as mature enough to give consent in those situations. And um, uh, most states do not have a mature minor law. There's I can't remember the exact number now. I think it's somewhere around 18 or 20 do. They're usually attached to an age. In other words, you generally have to be above 14 or 15 or 16. Um, and they also vary on who can make that determination, whether it needs to be a judge, whether it can be the physician themselves. Um, and there are some states that can't figure out if they have a mature minor law or not, and Washington State is one of those. And I'm not going to go into the um, craziness of our so-called mature minor doctrine, but to my reading as a non-lawyer and in consultation with several other experienced health lawyers, I'm not convinced we actually have a mature minor law that makes any sense. So I warn people against assuming that we do. And I can't speak to Oregon's situation. So how does this all look in a case like Dennis's? We talk about capacity to make decision making, and our traditional approach with adolescents has been a capacity-based approach, which the mature minor doctrine reflects, and which to some degree emancipated minor laws reflect. But as William Blake said, neither youth nor childhood is folly or incapacity. Some children are fools, and so are some old men, like the one sitting on that ridiculous Disney roller coaster that goes around Mickey Mouse's ears. By the way, those are not my children surrounding me. My children have their feet safely planted on the ground watching their father nauseate himself. Okay, so our conventional approach to adolescent capacity for decision making is to some degree based on studies done by Lois Wheathorn and her colleagues in the early 1980s. And what Wheathorn's studies demonstrated was that about at the age of 14 and above, most adolescents, and this language is important, have the capacity to make adult-like decisions. And that's what Dr. Wheathorn said. And that's what her studies demonstrated. They did not say always has the capacity or under every condition has the capacity. Because what's important to remember about Wheathorn's studies is they were basically classroom exercises. So they took adolescents in sort of non-stress, non-peer settings and had them work through an exercise that involved a complicated medical scenario and then compared their decision making to those of adults. And 14 seemed to be the sort of golden age at which an adolescent under those conditions, the decision-making process looked very adult-like, and so that's where this sort of since that time, this notion that kids above 14 have the capacity to make decisions for themselves comes from. To some degree, this work was reflected in an early statement by the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Bioethics on Informed Consent, Parental Permission, and Assent. That was written in 1995. It was greatly influenced by Bill Bartholomew, who was a legendary pediatric bioethics figure. This statement has subsequently been replaced by a newer one, but it remains historically a very important document that really, I think, in many ways set the stage. But it's also important to notice many people use this as an argument for saying that somebody like Dennis, or maybe at least Dennis at 16, should be able to make decisions like this. But the wording is really important here, and it illustrates something that it's an important lesson for people who are not used to reading philosophy and ethics. You got to read it really carefully, and because there's often a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. There are clinical situations, so not all of them. There are clinical situations in which a persistent refusal of assent or dissent may, important word there, may be ethically binding. A patient's reluctance or refusal to assent should also carry considerable weight when the proposed intervention, again key, is not essential to his or her welfare and or can be deferred without substantial risk. So this, you can see the conditions here start looking a whole lot like the harm principle. And in Dennis's case, none of those conditions are met. You're dealing with something that carries considerable weight and is essential to his welfare and can't be deferred without substantial risk. So that is sort of historically where we stood for years, and at the time Dennis's case arose. Now, what we know about adolescent decision making broadly, and when I trained, we generally knew these things, and the first is that adolescents, despite what those studies may have shown, although they're capable of performing at a level commensurate with their cognitive abilities, they often don't. And middle adolescents are more likely than younger adolescents to rely on analytic processing, but it's not their primary means of decision making like we generally have thought it to be in adults. And then middle and older adolescents have the ability to make adult-like decisions, but frequently don't use that ability. And so, one of the points I want to make is that our traditional approach, which looks at capacity, does not really capture what we see in adolescence, which is that they may have the capacity, but they're less inclined to use it as their primary decision-making mode, at least under certain conditions, than an adult would be. So let's look at the adolescent brain. And I've got this National Geographic article there because it was just a very nice summary of a lot of the science that's been done. That the issue came out after I'd done some of my work in this area, and in sort of layman's terms, nicely captured some of the science, which I'm going to very quickly summarize here. But what the science has sort of suggested is that our brains, not just adolescent brains, all of us, have a brain that operates really with two kind of parallel systems that do integrate with each other and work together, but not sort of consciously. In other words, in our consciousness. So these two pieces of the brain include the socio-emotional brain, for lack of a better term, and that's comprised largely of the limbic structures, the ventral striatum, those pieces of the brain that those of you who are not neurologists or neuroscientists learned in medical school and have completely forgotten where they are. And then the second system is comprised of the part we know about and think about, which is the quote unquote rational brain, which is largely centered in the prefrontal cortex. And that's the thinking part of the brain. That's the part that does calculations and that we're fully aware of at the conscious level. So let's talk about those two systems. The social-emotional system is, as it turns out, a core part of survival. It picks up on patterns often before we're consciously aware of them. and then motivates behavior change, not through thinking, but through feelings and autonomic responses. So think about the fight or flight reaction. Um, uh, it was on a hike in unfortunately, the beautiful canyons that are now burning in Southern California many years ago. I was just sort of off dreaming, not paying attention, and I suddenly found myself um, uh, having an immediate surge of adrenaline and jumping without and the only thing I was aware of at that point in time was that there was something on the trail. My brain had not identified what it was. The jump was completely involuntary, and that adrenaline response was not one I had any control over. So when I turned around, what I saw was a coiled rattlesnake. And my brain had recognized and motivated behavior on the basis of recognizing a pattern, not only well before my thinking brain knew what was happening, but without even fully recognizing what was happening. Um, and so this part of the brain is often a first impression part of the brain. It's based on thin sliced data, that could have just been a rock. But there was something about the pattern that my brain picked up on as being dangerous. The socio-emotional system is also one that kicks in and drives much of our social behavior. It's the part of the brain that um, we utilize a great deal in picking a life partner, for example. Often when we describe falling in love, we're really talking about the social emotional system. We may have difficulty, if pushed, your rational brain will kick in and give you all of the reasons and list the reasons why you should maybe have this person as a partner for the rest of your life and why you shouldn't. Um, but as we sometimes see in life, a good friend is perhaps dating someone who is a disaster and bad for them, and they seem to be the only person on the face of the earth that doesn't recognize it. And it's largely because the social-emotional system is overwhelmingly driving the desire to be with that person, and to some degree suppressing the rational system that might see those things that other people see if we were totally rational beings. The system that operates in parallel is the one you all know about. It's the one that does high-level reasoning, decision-making, impulse control, math, assesses consequences. So, uh, sometimes what somebody will do is when most of the time we pick our friends and our partners based on the way we feel about them, but there are many people who will do some kind of an assessment of the pros and cons of that sort of a thing, and in that case both systems are operating really the way they were designed to operate, which is together. That part of the brain also inhibits inappropriate behavior, adjusts behavior when a situation changes, sets priorities, and deals with probabilities. Um, Now, what's important to recognize is you need both of these, that there is not one system that's better than the other. And so one of the things I'm not saying is that um, somehow the socio-emotional brain is inferior to the rational brain. We need both of them. And there have been clinical cases through time that have beautifully illustrated them. One of them is the case of Phineas Gage, who is was a worker back in the 19 early 20th century, I think, and was tamping down some gunpowder, and the gunpowder exploded, sending the steel rod that he was tamping it with through his brain in the pattern you see there, which has been reconstructed based on his skull, which sits in a museum. Now, what was fascinating about the Phineas Gage case study is that he, despite the rudimentary medical care at that time, he survived that accident, but he was a very different person, and his decision making became very deficient. He started making decisions that were just bad for him and resulted in terrible consequences for his life. And people who had known him before said, Phineas isn't Phineas anymore. Now, the reason that case has become so fascinating is that rod preserved his prefrontal cortex. And what happened is it destroyed many of the structures that are responsible for the social-emotional aspects of the brain. And so Phineas became a hyper-rational individual. And that hyper-rationality actually did not serve his interests because it wasn't balanced by a piece of the brain that's responsible for picking up on social cues, for example, and the ability, it's what gives us our ability to read other people and other people's emotions and that sort of thing. And so if you lose one of these systems or have one of these systems impacted by a stroke, for example, it will impact your decision making, but in very different ways. So again, the point is that you really need both of these. Now, what happens during adolescent development to the brain? It's generally thought that the brain has two periods of very, very rapid growth and restructuring, one of which occurs during the toddler years, and the other of which occurs in early to mid adolescence. And in early to mid adolescence, there is a period where there's extensive remodeling and pruning going on. There are increased linkages connecting these two systems and structures within them, and increased myelinization, which enhances the rapidity with which decision making can occur. And the impact of those changes between 12 and 30 years of age, and this is important because although we define adolescence really, as those under 18 or 19 or 20, from a brain perspective, adolescence is not complete until the mid to late 20s. And what happens over that time is there's an improved balancing of impulses, desires, goals, self-interest, rules, and ethics, and an integration of memory and experience into decision making. And you might call that wisdom. There's an improvement in the ability to plan, and there's an improved balance in considering immediate rewards and future consequences, and balancing those two things. The social emotional brain is more interested in immediate rewards. The rational brain is the one that's able to calculate what the consequences of those immediate rewards might be for the future. And you can see here with these fMRI studies how that progression goes. What we know is that the brain does not fully mature until the mid to late 20s. Maturation occurs in a way that's described as back to front, which means basically that the quote unquote rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and those structures are the last to mature. And so what you really have during the adolescent years is an imbalance in these two systems, with the social emotional brain in the driver's seat and in a position to overpower the rational brain. The ideal situation in adulthood is that those two things will balance each other. And the social emotional brain still is faster. It often kicks in earlier, but the rational brain eventually will kick in. Males, it takes males about 2 years longer to mature. So if the average male has a fully matured brain by 27, the average female is probably at about 25. And so another way of thinking about this is that, when you've got an active limbic system or emotional social brain with sort of a not fully developed rational brain, that system is going to drive you to encounter a situation, have a strong emotion or feeling about it, and react based on that. So that's what I did jumping over that snake. That's what people often do when they meet somebody they really, really like, even if they don't know why. That's also, by the way, why con men are so effective. Con men, their whole strategy is to leverage your social emotional brain and minimize what your rational brain is doing. By the way, that is also what good marketing does. I mean, there's a reason, the Super Bowl is coming up in about a month. People love to watch the commercials. You'll notice that the most effective commercials are ones where you barely know what the product even is. It's like Clydesdale horses walking down the street or adorable puppies. And those are completely designed to make you feel good and have a warm, fuzzy feeling. And then at the very end, you may see the product name flash up. And the idea is they want you to associate that feeling you're having with their product. It's not about rationally thinking, what the heck do puppies have to do with insurance? Um, the Apple Store is a master at this. Their store is designed brilliantly to appeal to your limbic system. There's two things they do that leverage that. The first is that their products are all out there. They're beautiful, first of all, and they're all out there on display, and they're inviting you to touch them and play with them. And so you walk into an Apple store and you're confronted with these beautiful objects, and you pick them up and you start caressing them, and you fall in love with them, and that's the whole idea. And the second piece of that is they would prefer that you not leverage your rational brain to too great an extent, because then you may start wondering why you need an iPad when I already have an iPhone and an iMac at home. They don't want you to think about that. And so one way they have done to minimize that is that you'll notice that none of those computers have a card next to them that tells you how many gigabytes of memory it has and how much RAM and what the processing speed is, because that would engage your rational brain. You can find those things, but you actually have to use the machine to go onto the website to figure out what all those are. And that's all intentional, because they would rather have you leave the store with that beautiful object than sort of sit down and do that assessment and realize, maybe this isn't worth $1,000 to me when I have the tools I really need already. And I'll readily admit I have an iPad. I'm not sure why, but I do. The prefrontal cortex, in contrast to the limbic system, it sees a situation, and then rather than acting on a feeling or emotion, it assesses the situation and comes up with a plan. Um, and when these two things operate together, the situation may result in an emotion or feeling, but as long as you have a fully intact rational brain, the idea is that you can engage that, and then before you react, do an assessment and come up with a plan that makes sense. In the words of Lawrence Steinberg, who is an expert in this area, the adolescent brain has a well-developed accelerator, but only a partially developed brake. So what are the implications? Adolescence is really a developmental stage that you could describe as prefrontal cortex deficit disorder. And it explains why adolescents can be impulsive, inflexible, aggressive, reckless, emotionally volatile, risk-taking, reactive to stress, vulnerable to peer pressure, responsive to short-term rewards, excitement, and arousal, and often underestimating long-term consequences. And they may overlook alternatives. Now, adults can do all of these things too, but the point is that adults are, at least adults with fully and appropriately developed brains, and there are many things that can interfere with that process, that adults are more inclined to be able to engage their rational brains to balance what their emotional brains are telling them. And that doesn't mean it will override the emotional brain. The rational brain, most of the time, will probably agree. And the two will be in sync, which is the way we're most happy. But there are times where it's important for the rational brain to engage and recognize that what I'm about to do here is not very good for me. Now, what I loved about the National Geographic article is it explained to some degree from an evolutionary perspective why this isn't a defect, why it makes good sense. And one of the ways that author put it was, if we smartened up sooner, in other words, if our brains matured much earlier, we'd end up dumber, in the sense that a lot of that adolescent behavior drives them to learn. So they learn from their mistakes. And you know, the key to parenthood is to try to keep your adolescent from killing themselves, so that they can get to adulthood having learned from all of those mistakes without actually harming themselves. Um, Adolescence traditionally or evolutionarily is a period where a person is moving from the safety of the home to a complex outside world. And that requires adaptability and willingness to take some risks, which are really um, strengths of the social emotional system. Social connections are also very important, particularly in smaller communities, which is the way humans started. And the social emotional brain is very sensitive to social cues and social standing. Um, and then finally, you know, if you think back to when we all lived, you know, centuries ago in smaller communities that were where they were surrounded by danger, you know, the saber-toothed tiger and the other tribe across the way that might attack them. You wanted young risk-taking warriors. You didn't send out your 40 and 50-year-old people to scout and to fight your wars. You sent out the young adolescents who wouldn't hide and who wouldn't be scared and who would just, you know, see this as a grand adventure. And so to some degree, that social emotional system being the primary system makes sense in from an evolutionary perspective, and it's very adaptive for humans living in small communities. But at some point, over time, it needs to change. Um, Now, one of my favorite experiments that looks at this, I don't know how you do this kind of an experiment, but what they did was they took people and they had them do a driving exercise in an fMRI scanner to see what parts of their brain lit up. And what the fMRI scanner does is it looks at brain metabolism. So it gives you a rough idea anatomically of what parts of the brain are working when you're doing this. Um, and so you obviously have to make a lot of assumptions about, well, this part of the brain does that and so on. But you know, given the limitations, this study is fascinating. So what they did was they took a group of adults and they had them do this driving test, and they took a group of adolescents and they had them do this driving test. And the first iteration of the test was they both did the driving alone. So, you know, this is, you know, they're driving along and a car pulls out in front of them and they have to, you know, and then they come to a stop sign and they have to stop and they have to obey the speed limit and so on and so on. So you just ask them to drive. And in that iteration, when you look at the fMRIs, so in that iteration, there's two things that are important. The first is the adolescents drive just like the adults. They follow the rules, they drive safely, they don't speed. And the fMRI scanners look identical. It's what warms up, what heats up in the fMRI scanner is primarily their prefrontal cortex. Now you change this. You now take a couple of that person's friends and you put them in the room with them. You instruct the friends not to say anything, like not to egg their friends on, but just to watch. And so the mere presence of friends changes behavior, but not in adults. So the adults drive just like they did before, and their fMRI scanners look just like they did before. The adolescents, on the other hand, are now driving fast. They're going through stop signs, they're driving recklessly, and their fMRI scanners show a prefrontal cortex that's cold. And it's those limbic structures that are all lit up, the structures that are responsible for, you know, feeling good. Now, that's fascinating studies, and it shows sort of that in general, there are these differences in what drives adolescent and adult behavior and the part of the brain they're using in making that decision. So one of the real life examples I love, and those of you who have kids can think about this, is, you know, if you think about a teen who, let's say a 16-year-old, they've been out and they come home and uh, they sheepishly tell you that they got a ticket, they got stopped and they got a ticket for driving 50 in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. And since we're virtual, I can't do this, but when I have a live audience, I'll often tell them, okay, those of you who are parents, what do you say to your adolescent? And they all say the same thing. What were you thinking? And the adolescent always gives the same response, which is, I don't know. And then the typical parent thinks that the adolescent is being a wise ass, right? Just, you're being smart with me. What do you mean you don't know? But the truth is that's an honest response from the adolescent because they were not thinking. Um, what drove that reckless behavior was their social emotional brain. And um, in almost all of those situations, there were peers in the car. And so why were they driving 50 and a 25? Because it felt good. Had you sat them down at home before they left the house and said, would you, if you encounter a 25 mile per hour zone, would you drive 50? They would engage their rational brain because they're capable of that. And they would say, of course not. I don't want to get a ticket. It's dangerous. I don't want to risk my life. But then you put them in the situation, particularly with peers in the car, and that feeling, that good feeling they get from driving this way in front of their peers overrides that rational brain. And that's a sort of classic example. So, in summary, there is this imbalance that occurs during the adolescent and early 20s, adolescent years and early 20s, where the prefrontal cortex has not yet fully developed, but the subcortical areas, that social-emotional brain has. And so even though the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, it is capable of doing most of the things that adults can do. It's just not the primary mode of decision making yet. And so while adolescents can be very good at decision making tasks, there are certain situations that encourage the social emotional brain to take over. And those include emotionally charged situations, situations where an adolescent feels pressure, situations where there are peers surrounding the adolescent. Um, and they're very sensitive, more than adults are, to environmental cues, affective elements of decisions, rewards and punishments, and the presence of peers. Adults are also sensitive to those things, but not to the degree that adolescents are. And adolescents also have really not become very good yet at weighing future consequences as opposed to current rewards and feelings. And it explains a lot of what we know epidemiologically about adolescents. Um, if you look at injury data, almost every kind of injury that we know about, the high risk group is adolescents and early 20-year-olds. And that's in large part because they tend to be more impulsive and risk taking. Substance abuse, much higher incidence in teens and early 20s. And again, it's because of that sensitivity to sort of that good feeling that the substances give them, and the inability to kicking in and weigh what the future consequences of this may be. So what are, in sort of summarizing all of this, what are the implications for adolescent decision making? How does this maybe change the way we think about Dennis Lindbergh's case or change the way we think about those who argue that 15, 16-year-olds should be able to make life-altering decisions? Well, it's important to respect adolescents. Like I said, they do have this developing capacity to make decisions and they're practicing it. And they need to be involved in discussions and decisions about things that affect their lives. But we also, as people who work with this age group, need to recognize that even, when they're 17 and 18, their decision making may differ from mature decision making. And so it's important that we not just accept their decisions in a way that we might in adults. We need to recognize the kinds of situation in which decision making may be flawed, like situations where there's peer pressure. And they may need limits and direction. And most parents know that about their adolescents, that they need limits and direction. Um, There are some situations in which I think adolescents should be allowed to consent without parental involvement, and many of them are the ones in which we allow them to, where risk of harm is low, where the benefits are clear, and where the law allows it. Now, to go back to Dennis's, so the bottom line for me in a case like Dennis's is that if we're facing a decision in the medical realm, that's one that we would not allow the parent to make, or in Dennis's case, his aunt to make, and we already established that refusing blood was one of those, then we shouldn't allow the adolescent to make it either. In other words, we shouldn't be allowing adolescents to make decisions that place their lives at significant risk of serious harm. And we should have great reluctance to do that. So, there are end of life decisions for those of you, who work in the palliative care field or the ICU, where you have maybe a 16 or 17-year-old who has a chronic illness. And they are at the end of their life's trajectory and preparing to die. I think that's a different scenario. That's a scenario where we would allow their parent to say, we don't want, them to be on a ventilator anymore. If it comes to that. And I think that's a situation where, we would allow the parents to make it. This is an adolescent who's had experience with this disease and illness and maybe been there before. They should have a lot to say about that. But that's very different than an adolescent like Dennis, who is just been diagnosed with a serious illness and is refusing something that will potentially save his life. And there are other elements to Dennis's case that are really important, because although we often think about peers as friends, parents, and in Dennis's case, his aunt, are also peers. And kids in these crisis situations feel a lot of pressure to do what their parents want them to do. And more importantly, in Dennis's case, he belongs to a church that places tremendous pressure on those who belong to that church to hew to their requirements. So Dennis has a church elder sitting at his bedside 24 hours a day. If that's not peer pressure, I don't know what is. That's peer pressure that most adults would have difficulty fighting. There's no way an adolescent is going to be able to do so. So I think it's important to be aware of these elements. And I think it's important that we not simply assume that adolescents can make life-altering decisions without, some constraints. So I will end there, and I am happy to entertain questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, though, so that I can go back and see y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Diekema. It's an excellent presentation. I've heard it a few years ago, and still refreshing to have you speak on this topic. We have a few questions in the chat. The first, it's more of a comment. So mention of the Apple Store raised the question of how devices on the internet, which are designed to be distracting and addictive, are changing adult brains as well as adolescent brains. As a bicycle commuter, I observe many adult drivers, alone or with others in the vehicle, who are not letting the prefrontal cortex lead on their driving behavior. I'm somewhat playful, playing with Dr. Diekema's examples, but it does feel like there is a larger cognitive shift happening to people in advanced societies, as we have great exposure to these additive, manipulative tools that are now interwoven with so many aspects of our lives, from childhood through old age.
I think you're absolutely right. I have, and I'm not the only one. Jonathan Haidt has written a book, and others are sort of noticing this shift. And in my experience, I do think the impact of social media and devices has not been good. I think one of the things that we're seeing happen, and let me add that I think the second element here was COVID. Actually, I think what COVID did was greatly impacted what our social-emotional brains are so good at, which is picking up on social cues, interacting with other people, and as things moved online and away from getting together. And we still have not come back from that. I mean, people are still more inclined to stay to themselves and not go back to these community settings in which they used to thrive. I think it's made people more self-centered, quite frankly, and it explains a lot of the way you see people driving and behaving, and social media is not helping that. Social media, I think, has had a profound impact on sort of immaturing our brains. So I worry about that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. These are really, really concerning trends, and I don't have a good answer for that, for how we fix that. All of the social media stuff, by the way, it's designed to be addictive, right? None of that stuff leverages your rational brain. It's all designed to, get clicks, right? And that's all about the social emotional brain wanting to be rewarded.
We have a few questions and comments by John Gottschall. John, if you are able to unmute and speak up, please do. If not, I'll read your comments and questions. Okay, he's not
So
able to
John,
unmute.
it looks like, so John's questions, one of them relates to the role of prescribed and self-administered medications like ethanol and THC and other illicit drugs, maybe, on the adolescent brain. And there's good evidence that it does impact full maturation. And so it's one of the things that we know adolescence is a high risk period for substance abuse. And what we also know is that that those substance abuse behaviors can actually impact final brain development in important ways. And so it's just, one more reason to be attentive and alert about those issues. And the other relates to kids with developmental disorders like ASD and ADHD and others. And those, clearly have an impact. There are, I think it's overly simplistic, but to use autism spectrum disorder as an example, there are some people that think some of the elements of autism spectrum disorder are actually related to the fact that the social emotional brain is maybe not fully developed. And so what you have, at least in some of those cases, is somebody with that kind of hyper rational brain that like Phineas Gage had, because they may not be as in tune to sort of social cues and social interactions and those sorts of things. And that can impact the way society then interacts with them and can affect their lives. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty simple answer, but I think you're raising two really important elements that can impact brain development or do impact brain development.
Thank you. We are at 9 o'clock, so I just want to thank the audience for their attendance and announce the next speaker for the next lecture in the series. I believe we can stay on for a few minutes for people who want to stay on and ask questions. The next speaker in the series will be on Friday, February 7th. The speaker will be Dr. Melissa Grabois, an associate professor of history at the University of Oregon. A flyer with the link to the talk will be sent via email soon. Hey, Dr. Diekema, I have a question for you. I put it in the chat early on. The significant risk of serious and imminent harm. Sometimes when we are applying in situations, the imminent piece is not that clear. Or in other words, there's high degree of certainty that if you're going to wait for a few days or a week or something like that, harm is going to happen, but it is not imminent in the sense that if you don't proceed tomorrow, there is going to be clinical deterioration. How would you approach those situations?
So you asked probably the question I get asked the most about the criterion I set up with regard to working through the harm principle and applying it. The eminence criterion is the one people struggle with the most, and I understand that, and if I were writing that paper today, I would probably try to revise that in some way. And I know a couple of scholars who are actually in the process of trying to work on papers where they, because they've talked with me about it, where they try to refine that notion some. So what I can do is tell you what I intended with the eminence criterion. And it was really intended to be a way of assuring that we didn't take this very disruptive step of involving state power until it was absolutely necessary, and had exhausted more respectful means like persuasion and discussion. But in every case, you reach a point where, we've now reached the point where, although maybe we haven't started to see harm accrue, it could happen tomorrow. And I think you've probably met the criterion at that point. I mean, so to give you an example of how I've applied this, I had an ethics consult years ago from an oncology team where the parents, for a variety of reasons, refused chemotherapy. And so the question I asked the oncologist was, well, how long do you think you can go before you start treating this child without running the risk of complications from not treating or starting to impact your ability to cure the disease? And, his answer, I'm sure was a guess, but it was an educated guess. And he said probably about a week. And so I said, okay, so you got a week to work with the family before we, leverage state power. And so we set up a plan for them to try to work with this family and keep us from doing that. And sometimes it takes some time to leverage. If you're going to get a court order, for example, it doesn't happen tomorrow. So, you may need to start those wheels a couple of days before the quote unquote deadline. But, the reason, I think that's important is illustrated by that case, which is that it took 5 days. But that oncologist was able to figure out a strategy for getting these parents to see that treating their child was really important. And it saved a relationship with the treating team and made treatment of this kid much more successful than it would have been if we had had a family that was angry and upset that we had invoked the state. So that's really what it's intended to do. It's not intended to be, you've got to wait until damage has started to happen or harm has started to happen.
Thank you. We have